stability in the region.
Kenny MacAskill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I obviously rise to take a minority view within the Chamber, given the views of the representative parties, other than a few individuals, but it's not an insignificant view, I think, within the wider country. And that is that those who oppose an escalation in an area that is already a tinderbox, that worry about a lurch to war and seek instead a push for peace. And of course we condemn the actions of the Houthis, as indeed has been done, as people have said, by the UN Security Council, as we rightly condemn Hamas, because, as I will go on to say, these issues are inextricably linked. But this is an escalation. We haven't been bombing Somalia when it comes with regard to piracy or Eritrea, and although it's a while since President Obama launched cruise missiles on Al-Shabaab, it seems to be the Houthis that are being picked upon at the moment, albeit they are breaching international law and have to be held to some account. But this is an escalation against a country that is already one of the poorest in the world, in which this will inflict further harm. It is a country that has endured 10 years of bombing through Saudi Arabia, who have been armed with the finest munitions that the US and UK could provide them. And that hasn't managed to destroy them. Somehow or other, despite providing with all that equipment, at great benefit to many private corporations, the Houthis have continued to be able to do this harm and destruction. That obviously will continue, because we've already had one set of strikes, we're now on to a second. How many more sets of strikes are there to be before either there's an escalation or indeed a call to halt? And indeed, we've also heard that, I think it was the Minister himself who stated that surface-to-air missiles had been taken out. I don't claim to have any military expertise, but surface-to-air missiles don't seem to me to have any logical basis for the Houthis attacking shipping. That more appears to be related more to perhaps the USA and their defence of their own vested interests. But this is a lurch towards wider war. We have heard across the chamber, shamefully I would say, comments about Iran, conflict with Russia, conflict with China. I come from a family where my grandfather fought in World War I. My father fought in World War II. Both fought to try and ensure that their children would never have to fight in another conflict. I do not wish to see my children or my grandchildren end up in World War III. And yet there seems to be an almost Dr. Strangelove tendency among some that are pulling us in that direction. And even if we don't go down that precipitous route with all the disaster that envelops it, then we also face the legacy of hatred that we've seen from Afghanistan and especially from Iraq. Because don't think that people will view this as neutral. People, not simply the Houthis, but people in the Arab world, people in the Muslim world, people in our own country, will see this as one-sided, as judgmental, as picking upon one side, and yet failing to do anything about the issue that is fundamental to it, which is what is happening in Gaza. So we run the risk of worsening terrorism, both abroad and indeed homegrown. And indeed that then takes us on to why are the Houthis doing it? I think it's risible to say that it's not connected to Gaza. Of course it is. The timeline speaks to that. Trade was going, not without difficulties, but trade was going prior to the 7th of October. The timeline dictates that that was the cause of it. And indeed, the Houthis have told us in their almost webcam invasion or landing on the tanker, they even flew the Palestinian flag. It was reminiscent of when Britain put a helicopter and landed somebody so we could have a flag on Rockall. They made it clear that what they were doing related to what was happening in Gaza. And that is why, to get peace, as I said in the statement by the Prime Minister earlier in the week, you're required to look in conflict resolution, not simply at the manifestations, but at the fundamental root, and at the root is what is happening in Gaza. We have heard today that the purpose of the airstrikes is to preserve international law. Well, international law also covers stopping a genocide. We have heard from other speakers very eloquently pointing out that 25,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza. 1.1% of the population, 70% of them women and children. What would that be in UK terms? That in UK terms would be almost 750,000 people. 750,000 UK citizens wiped out since 7th of October. Do you think that that would be unnoticed? And yet, what has happened? We have said that Netanyahu is maybe going a bit far, that maybe Israel has to call it all back. What we should be doing is supporting South Africa and other countries in pushing this at the International Court of Justice. I believe and I expect that the International Court of Justice on Friday, as people have suggested, will rule against Israel, because what Israel is doing is fundamentally wrong and we need to call that out. If we want to make sure that we get trade going, which we do, if we want to make sure that we protect seafarers, not so much UK seafarers, because there was no rush to protect the P&O workers when they were gruesomely treated, and most of those sailing on these ships, which only one I think was UK, weren't UK flagged. But if we do want to ensure that maritime trade, then we have to solve the problem in Gaza. That is where the solution lies, and that is why we must not have a rush towards escalation. We have to have a push towards peace. And in terms of enforcing international law, it's not enough to enforce international maritime law and the freedom of movement. What about protecting the rights of women, children, and even children who are having amputations carried out without anaesthetic? International law, you cannot pick and choose, and it's about time that the UK stood up for the rights of the Palestinian people.